everyone. Welcome to CTO Talks Online. My name is Kaushik. I am Director of Product Management at ThisFlow. And today I have an old-time Orangescape alumni, a very close friend, and the director, one of the directors at Yelp, Sharadha Ramakrishnan, joining us.
Hi.
I'm really happy to have you on board. And I'm very excited to speak about a lot of things with you. For the ones who are joining us, CTO Talks, where we speak to very interesting folks from the technology landscape, about technology, about issues surrounding technology, engineering, management, etc. And Sharadha has been one of the Sharadha has been an inspiration for a lot of people. She's been doing a lot of things. She's a super mom. She sings. She dabbles with photography, and all this while also leading a very talented team of engineers at Yelp. So great to have you on board, Sharadha. And let's start off with how you actually ended up being where you are today. So how has the journey been so far?
Thank you for the very, very kind introduction, Gao. I know, we've definitely gone a long way in the past, and I do want to say that I think one of the primary reasons I am here today is because you forced me, in fact, to take the interview at Orangescape and said, you really have to check out this company. There's so many great things going on here. And it was all true. And I'm really glad I turned up that day to do the interview. Thanks for having me on. So how did I get here? What's my journey? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. So I went through a very traditional education path. So I took biology in my 11th and 12th grades, and then I moved on to computer science. So I studied software engineering and did my master's in software engineering. And I think after that is when it got a bit non-traditional, where I decided to start found my own startup right after school. And the primary reason for doing that was because I did my final semester internship at a company called MCAM in Charlottesville, Virginia. And the founder there was extremely inspiring and decided that he would give me the contract to build out their risk assessment platform for intellectual property rights. And that led to Monkey Creative Labs in Chennai, where I hired a team of 5 engineers. We were consulting with a bunch of different companies and also building a product. It was a social engine that we were attempting to build. That led me to work with a bunch of other startups in the United States, doing everything from developing UDP protocols for mobile networks, building online try before you buy web shops, and all the way to building microservices architecture. So right around 2013, after my stint with Orangescape, and where I dabbled pretty heavily in JavaScript, I got married. And I think one of the combined decisions that my husband and I took together was I would spend some time in the industry, getting some experience, because I had literally no experience in the industry, and then go back to being a founder if I'd liked. So that's when I started interviewing. I interviewed with a bunch of companies and came down to Uber and Yelp, and primarily picked Yelp because of the amazing culture and just the amazing people that I met, which is very, very important to me. And I think I made the right choice. The kind of growth that I've seen at the company has been phenomenal. It started off as a distributed systems engineer, but very soon moved to being a manager. Like in 3 months, moved to being a manager at Yelp. And in fact, I think they hired me for that, just didn't tell me. And in 2017, got the opportunity to build the metrics platform, just basically putting together a bunch of teams in different parts of the company to build a centralized metrics platform. And that eventually evolved to being the data and analytics platform. And today we're over 40 people in the data and analytics platform, spread across the United States, Canada, and Europe. And I currently take care of these set of teams.
Very interesting. That should have been a very interesting ride. So one of the things that you were telling me was how you had decided to go back to the United States with your husband, and you wanted to get some more industry experience and such. I also remember, I mean, how hard was it to get your first gig in technology? Did you perceive any challenges there? And what were the kind of challenges, especially for someone who had immediately switched to a managerial role after you ended up at Yale? It's very hard to like find female managers on this thing. I don't know whether it's insensitive to talk about. I mean, say it that way, but yeah, it has been one of the problems surrounding the entire industry, where there is a disproportionate amount of managers and male leadership when compared to women in technology. So first, why don't you talk about how you found it what was your experience when you got started there, that specific bit, and then let's talk about women in technology and women in technology leadership.
Yeah, I think there's a few different questions in there. I think one of them is like, how hard was it to get a gig in the industry? And then the second one is just basically talking about women in leadership specifically, and my thoughts on that. So I guess I can approach the first question in a couple of different ways. Like, one is very personally, like I had not worked in very large companies. Like the biggest company I'd ever worked with was, I think, Orangenscape, which was at the time with 30 people strong. And so there were a lot of things that were very new to me when I started interviewing. Interview process included, right? So what kinds of things do people expect in the industry? What kind of processes do people expect? Even the kind of etiquette and decorum in terms of, how do you present yourself? What kinds of things do you talk about? So that was a learning experience for me. And of course, that came with interviewing over and over and over again, like casting the net really wide, making sure that I talked to a bunch of different companies. And I think on the other hand, there was also a journey for me to figure out what's right for me, like where will I thrive? What kind of atmosphere do I really want? And so doing all of those interviews definitely helped me figure that out and say, okay, this is a place that, will give me the opportunities that I want to see. I think the other aspect of it is also like, the general dearth of women representation in technology. And I'm talking about women representation, but there's also several other underrepresented minorities. But I'm talking specifically about women because that's what, that's what I've experienced. But I think that it affected me in a couple of different ways. One is definitely confidence. Like, you don't see a lot of people like yourself in the industry. And that affects the way you feel like you could perform. Like, if you don't see people like yourself and you're like, you don't really know what is expected out of you. And so that was definitely something that I had to work through. And secondly, that confidence issue also led to reflecting in how confident I was in my technical abilities. So I did take kind of a longer route to get to where I was more confident about interviewing, where I actually spent 9 months going back to school, in fact, to study Linux kernel architecture, because I was like, okay, this is after my master's, I felt like this is going to definitely give me the confidence. So I don't have to feel like an imposter doing this, like there was heavy imposter syndrome that I had to work through. So that's kind of the part where, the challenges I kind of faced getting into the industry itself. Once I was in, I think, I don't know if it was luck or if it was something else that landed me at Yelp, but I basically made it to a place that values diversity and inclusion above everything else. Like the kind of opportunities and the kind of support that I have seen at Yelp I can say, as a matter of fact, is very rare to come by, and the amount of importance they put into supporting underrepresented minorities and women in technology, like, that's pretty phenomenal. And even when I did take up the management opportunity, I asked my manager at the time, like, what if I fail? What if I don't like it? And the answer I got was, we're giving you this opportunity. It's not like we're going to kick you out if you fail. Like, we're going to give you all the support you need. But if this is not something you want to do, or it's not something that you're cut out for, you just go back right back to being an engineer, and that kind of support, that kind of, confidence is definitely something that I needed to step into the role and start performing.
So it's the support from your managers is one of the most important things that come into play. But if you were to advise all the women, women cadre who are in technology companies. So one of the things that I've been observing is from back in 2013 to how things are right now, I see a lot more women like actually joining technology companies, actually taking part in doing high tech work, etc., etc. Things are getting a little better, definitely. But
Yes.
If you were to talk to these guys, if you were to want to advise these people, what would you want to say to them so that they get out of the individual contributor by a lead role to a managerial to a leadership role? What do you think is the gap that they need to like address, especially women, but yeah, generally?
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the primary things that I will probably focus on is, a lot of people, when they get asked, how did you get into a leadership role, or how did you make it into management, the answer they often receive is, I was at the right place at the right time. And that helps nobody. Like, we have got to be a lot more objective than that, right? Like, we need to be able to tell someone how to replicate success for them to be able to do the same thing. So I'd say, for the candidates themselves that are looking to step into leadership, my one suggestion will be to go out and find a sponsor, to go out and find not just a mentor, but a sponsor, someone who will sponsor you at venues where you don't have a seat at the table, someone who will, put their faith in you and say, okay, this person can do what I do as well as me, or better than I can, and I would trust them to represent me in this venue, and I value their diverse inputs. And so I think going out there and finding a sponsor is the most important thing that you can do. Of course, it takes a little bit of time to get there, to build a confidence where you can go ask someone that. And for that, you need to put yourself out, right? Like, you need to put your work out, you need to network, you need to write blogs, you need to, even if you're not into writing or into networking or into public speaking, I think at the very least, making sure that your voice is heard. And all of this, again, the burden is not on the underrepresented minority entirely, right? I think I'm saying all of this with the guidance that keep your company and your manager accountable to a higher standard. Ask them to provide you an inclusive environment, and speak up when you don't really get that. And oftentimes you don't feel protected speaking up, and sometimes you go with the flow, you go with the, oh, let me keep doing my work and rewards will come to me. I don't think that works anymore. Like, you really have to hold people to a higher standard. And communities and employee resource groups really help. Like, joining employee resource groups, making sure that you're not the only one in isolation trying to go through this. And if you think about traditional engineering teams, like you think about infrastructure teams, I've been the only woman in several teams. And so the things that I go through, obviously I'm not seeing other people go through the same thing. And I'm like, oh, maybe I'm the only one, but that's not really the case. When you try and join communities, whether they're employee resource groups in your own company or in other companies, and you talk about these things, you realize, okay, this is systemic. This is something that we can solve as a group. We can hold people to a higher standard. So that's the advice that I would give them. Again, it's not entirely possible on just one side. So I will say, along with that comes my advice for the other side, for the companies supporting these women and other underrepresented minorities. Like, there's no question that diversity and inclusion is important. There shouldn't be a question anymore, because it is important. Like, if you care about your product, if you care about your customers, you're going to need diverse people at the table building your product. So, and, at the end of the day, it matters. And so you're going to have to support these people. So, hold yourselves to a higher standard. Make sure there's psychological safety for people to speak up. Make sure there's psychological safety for people to bring their whole self to work, right? And sponsor people. Like, at the end of the day, if you have a seat at the table and you're like, okay, I know this amazing woman who is an engineer and she's doing really great and she has all of this potential, put her at that table and ask her to speak up, so she doesn't need the title, she just needs that representation. So that's kind of where I'm very passionate about this, if you can't tell.
Yes, I could see that very clearly. And I'm sure the culture bit plays a very huge role. I mean, all this, I think we could summarize by just a single word, the kind of culture that you're building inside a company. But more importantly, I've realized in lots of companies that there is a subculture, especially associated with the engineering teams. What do you think about that subculture? I mean, I usually the prototypical engineering team is a lot more intense and might have certain uniqueness that that could be different from the company's culture per se, or that could be unique about the team itself. How important has it been for you to foster a good, healthy engineering culture, and has that given better results for you? Has that made life easier for the folks inside the engineering team?
Yeah, 100%. And I think I'll again answer that by way of saying that's how you build inclusive teams, right? So at the end of the day, it's not just enough if you have diverse people on your team. You need to support them to feel included, to feel like they belong where they are, and that their voice matters. So at the end of the day, if you have kind of the culture where it's like, okay, it's cool to stay back till 9 p.m. and or it's it's cool to go out drinking every other day, or it's it's cool to make discriminatory jokes, and I think at the end of the day, what ends up happening is people feel excluded from those scenarios. And I'm not saying that apart from the discriminatory jokes, that should never happen. I'm not saying alcohol is bad. I'm not saying that staying back late is bad. But I think at the end of the day, if you want to build a really wholesome team, you need to make sure that there are certain things that you get right, like work-life balance, for example, like making sure that people are healthy. Like, at the end of the day, you need time for your mental health, you need time for your family, you need time for your friends, and that's how you show up as your whole self to work. And that needs to be facilitated. Like, managers cannot be celebrating people that are working over the weekends or working overtime, because that puts unnecessary pressure on the new mother or the new father, or someone who is caretaking, and that shouldn't be the case at all. And then on the other hand, making sure that people feel included in team activities, even if there is alcohol involved. How do you make sure that someone who doesn't consume alcohol feels comfortable going to an event? Similarly, when you have offsites, making sure everybody's voice is accounted for, and you plan events in a way where everyone feels comfortable showing up. Like, I think it goes down to every single detail, even in a meeting, making sure that interruptions are minimized, making sure there's a decorum in terms of who speaks when. We have simple things like hand signals that indicate that you want to speak, and then making sure that there's a mediator that says who goes first, because there's oftentimes, there's people that are the loudest in the room, there's people that don't speak as much. Making sure you pay attention to all of these things, and it's learned. It's something that you cultivate over the years and make sure that you're watching out for.
With the pandemic looming, was there a shift in the kind of culture that you had created, and what were the new routines, new rituals that your team set up in order to be as close and cohesive as it used to be pre-pandemic times?
Yeah, the pandemic has definitely challenged a lot of people's take on culture, right? Especially, I think at Yelp, we value our work-life balance and our culture so much. I mean, that's what we're known for. And once you're in front of a screen, those lines are blurred. Like you're sitting. Many people have studio apartments here, so you're kind of working, sleeping, kind of living in the same place, and the lines get blurred. So how do you ensure that someone, like as a manager, when I go into work and I see someone at 6 p.m., I'm like, okay, when are you going home? Like what plans for the night? But you can't do that in a virtual environment. Like you can't see how long people are working, apart from monitoring like code reviews and looking at people's meetings, and more than that, we're also a very distributed team. Like we work across time zones, and there's several things we need to make sure that where we need to make sure people are not working outside of their local time working hours, and making sure we're cognizant of that. So and then of course, with the virtuality, all of this stuff around grabbing coffees together, or going for team lunches, or even walking over to somebody's desk and talking about their day, like all of that is just gone straight out the window. It's all got now a higher barrier to entry. You need to put a time on people's calendars. You need to like go over to them in Slack, or talk to them over IRC. So it's definitely a higher barrier to entry. But some of the ways we have circumvented that is making sure that we do recreate some of that virtually, while we're being cognizant of people's local time zones. So making sure there's an explicit understanding that meetings don't get scheduled outside of people's working hours. Everyone has marked their working hours on their calendars, including social events happen within those working hours. So teams have coffee runs that they do. We have game days or game nights, depending on where you're at. We have trivia, we have all hands, we have a lot of different ways that teams, bond and stick together during these times. And as a manager, I try to drop in on as many as I can, just to make sure, I stay in touch with the teams. And then, of course, there's also company-sponsored, events. Like hackathon is still a thing at Yelp. We do that every twice a year, and it's a huge event. Like we all get together and hack on things that we don't usually work on for 3 days of the week, twice a year, and that's a huge bonding event. So we're definitely striving to keep that culture going.
There was a very specific question that a couple of the folks who are like speaking about this interview were asking me to ask you. You were mentioning about meetings. Engineers generally hate meetings because they are creative people. I mean, they are the ones who are creating things, and meetings are disruptions whatsoever. So how has that been for you, and have you worked specifically towards like figuring out dedicated engineering coding time versus meeting and resolution time, etc.?
For myself?
For yourself and your team.
So it's been ages since I wrote code. So I'm not writing code anymore because I block my team when I write code. I'm simply too interrupt driven at this point to be productive writing code. But for my teams, the philosophy that I have is any meeting should be useful to the people attending and not useful to management. Like at the end of the day, if the meeting is a status update that the manager needs to get from the teammates, and it's not useful for the engineers themselves, then I would say that doesn't have to be a meeting. Like it could be a document, it could be a virtual stand-up that you do. Like you don't necessarily have to have a meeting. So one way we have circumvented engineers feeling burnt out by meetings is making sure that all meetings are agenda driven, and engineers take turns in running them or mediating them, so that they have an idea of what's useful to people. They get to set the agenda, they get to practice meeting driving skills, and we also make sure to keep meetings respectful of people's time. Like if there's no agenda, then you don't have a meeting. You can cancel it if there's nothing to talk about. Similarly, like also making sure that stuff like team meetings every week or cadence meetings comes with a very solid purpose where you want to understand what your teammates are doing. And then of course at the end of the day, I always tell my team, no one can say no to an experiment, right? You try something out for 2 weeks. If it doesn't work, let's change it. Like constantly polling the team, understanding what their feedback is. If something's a waste of time for everybody on the team and it's a time sink, then you can try and motivate the value. But if that's not seen by everybody, then you simply don't have to have it. So that's kind of how we've approached team meetings, and we try and keep it to a minimum. But I guess my job fundamentally revolves around being in meetings and making decisions in meetings and meeting people and understanding context. So for me personally, my day is full of meetings, but that's just how I function, and I enjoy it, quite honestly.
Cool. Another question is, how heavy is your entire engineering process itself? In the sense that the two extremes of things being extremely procedural and everything is like thought through completely, everything is very waterfallish, and the other end where there's extreme agility, where everything is done based on like quick business requirements. Both are extremely hard on engineers, and usually the balance of both is what makes a very efficient engineering team. So how has it been for you, and what are the unique things about your engineering processes that you think would make sense to a lot of technology companies out there?
Yeah, so we are not a waterfall-y company at all. We're very agile when it comes to building things. Like we'll very much go the route of build a POC, see what works, iterate on it, throw away prototypes, and then build on top of that kind of company. But very specifically with respect to the data team, like you said, oftentimes we are having to adopt a little bit of the waterfall method as well. Like if you can imagine, for example, if we're thinking about how do we design a new log that's going to tell us something about the product, then it is critical that we start from data modeling. We start with getting that model reviewed. We start with, and then we move into, okay, how do we implement this data model in the app itself, and how do we actually get it from there to flowing through the data pipeline, eventually stored, and what kind of processes does it need to go through? Of course, that can be done in a very POC type method, but there is a little bit of a waterfall approach there as well. And that kind of mix is definitely starting to make a little bit of sense for us when we're building out this data and analytics platform, particularly with respect to, how much, whenever something gets created and dependencies start forming on it, any upstream changes causes a lot of disruption downstream. But I think at the end of the day, it really depends on, I don't think there's a point in saying we are this or we are that. Like, I think it definitely depends on evaluating, what the use case is and what is needed for the hour, and how the team is set up. Like sometimes you have a team with product managers all ready to go. There's requirement gathering done. There's everything set up, and you're like, okay, this is exactly the solution. We know what to implement, and you go do it. But then at other times, you're trying to figure it out. Like you're trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. You're trying to figure out, okay, is this what the customer is asking for? Because customers often come to you and say, this is what we want. But what do they really need is something that you need to think about. So, and oftentimes at that point, product managers have to work with the engineers to build POCs to try and understand, okay, is this something that is going to work in this case? So it's definitely a mix. And I'd say, like, at the end of the day, trying to figure out when you want to pick one over the other is a conversation, and definitely should be had, rather than saying, we're just following this one way of working.
Nice. So another thing, because Yelp serves millions of people out there, usually there is this additional onus of like writing code which not only works and which is bug free, but it should also be reliable and available for those millions of people out there. Especially we're talking about data analytics platform. It has to be available 24/7. You miss data for a minute, and you've got a big gap that you want, big gap of data that you would not have addressed. So these reliability and availability engineering is not something that is taught in schools. So how do you mentor engineers to get used to this new paradigm where you're like serving millions of customers out there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I talk about this to all the new candidates applying to be part of the data and analytics platform, and what an important part of being an engineer on a platform it is to be able to work on reactive things, on things that break, on things that, so basically going on call for something, what does that mean, and what's the responsibility that comes with it? And that's everything that you're talking about, which is, it's not just about writing this code and pushing it to production, but what happens after, what happens when something breaks. So I think fundamentally it is extremely important for a company to develop an incident response process. So it is the one thing that I will advocate any engineering team does if they have not already done it, because by developing an incident response process, you are directly contributing to engineering happiness, right? Developer productivity and engineering happiness. Because at the end of the day, if an engineer is on call and there is no incident response process where something breaks, there's an alert that goes off, you're monitoring something, an alert goes off. If there are no run books, if there's no way to say what the impact is, if there's no way to say who to communicate the impact to, and if there's no way to say, develop a team around it to say, okay, here's exactly how we're going to mitigate this risk and move towards resolution, it's complete chaos. Because at that point, you don't really know who's investigating the issue, who's communicating, who's shielding the team from all of the questions coming in. What level of incident is it? Like, is it extremely serious where it's impacting revenue, or is it a minor issue that doesn't have to be so widespread? So I think that companies need to invest in building great incident response processes. And at the end of the day, when engineers join, and even if they're not familiar with these things in the past, at Yelp, we follow a very heavy mentorship model where engineers come on board, they're given a mentor that works very closely with them to take them through the ropes of their first few tickets and then their first project. And one of the milestones is you go on point and then you go on call, maybe at around like the 6-month mark, where you feel ready that, okay, if I get paged at 8 p.m. at night, I can handle this and I can also pull in other people. But that only works if you have a solid process in place. And again, at the end of the day, like making sure engineers understand that even if they're on call, it's not solely on them to fix everything. Like, we are a team at the end of the day. Sure, you're the first responder, but at the end of the day, your team is standing behind you, your manager's behind you. And then, of course, like, to mitigate even getting to that place, you need to have solid processes in place, right? Like, you need to have your quality checks, you need to have your monitoring in place, you need to make sure that alerts are not noisy, because it can lead to alert fatigue, where you just keep getting alerts, there's no action on it, and you're like, okay, I don't care about this anymore until it's time to care about it. So I think I can keep talking about incident response forever, but I think it's a very important thing that companies need to invest in.
Right. Follow up to that. So reactive and proactive engineering. So a bit on the proactive side of engineering. So usually there is going to be an engineering team which is responsible for shipping code, and there is a DevOps team which is responsible for ensuring that this code works reliably on the server farm or on the cloud for millions of people out there. Do you expect your engineers to also understand the nuances of DevOps while developing, and how does that really work? Because lots of times engineers develop code, but that code running on the DevOps infrastructure is a big nightmare. There's a lot of gaps between engineering and DevOps. So is that something that you observe as a commonplace thing, or is that something you've mitigated in your teams? So how does
I would say we've been pretty successful at mitigating that. So at Yelp, every engineer writes their own code, tests their own code, pushes their own code to production, and they're responsible for their own code. So we have gotten rid of the whole SRE model where there's a first responding team to every incident that happens. Every team is responsible for their own, monitoring and alerts and their own services. And at the end of the day, if you're pushing something to production, it's your responsibility to make sure that it's continuing to function in production. And of course, like I said, you can depend on the production engineering team for support, but at the end of the day, you're the first responder and you're kind of, working through it. So I would say we've done pretty well in terms of educating and enabling engineers to be in a position where they're able to play both roles, where it's not just one person shipping the code, another person responsible for production. And part of that is, investing in this incident response process and running trainings and educating people to go through that. Another thing we do is also deputyship. It's, something that we do is called, we call ops deputyship, where if you as a person are joining Yelp and you're an engineer and you need access to certain things. Primarily, why do we have a separate SRE team? Because we don't want to give access to every single person to do certain things, right? So at the end of the day, if they do go through a set of training material and at the, an SRE or a production engineering person is able to say, okay, I'm comfortable with giving permissions to this person to do certain things, then they become the ops deputy on the team. So we empower organizations outside of ops or outside of production engineering to do things that you would typically depend on the production engineering team to do. So kind of scaling that model out. And deputyships also come in a lot of different, other spaces as well, like security deputyships, mobile deputyships. So there's a lot of different ways in which we kind of implement deputyships. And then I will also say, finally, in the incident response kind of process, the end of incident response is postmorteming, right? So once an incident is done, you've fought the fire, you've kind of mitigated the issue, you do have to learn from what happened. And so we follow something called the blameless culture at Yelp, where it's not one person's fault that something happened. It's obviously a process or a system that didn't work. So how can we as a team get together and postmortem that issue? How can we bring out lessons learned and action items to mitigate this in the future? We actually send out that postmortem for the entire company to read. And so that becomes like valuable lessons for other teams to follow as well.
So very love the blameless culture and the fact that you're actually distributing it for the entire company. That's great levels of transparency, right? And so how does the tech stack for your division look like nowadays?
Let's see. So there's a lot of different technologies that we adopt. So we are a Python shop, but some teams are more of a polyglot. Like my team develops SDKs for data capture, and we support Android, iOS, Java, JavaScript, Python. So there's people on the team that write Kotlin and Swift and Java alongside Python as well. There's also people that write Rust, but I will keep that story for another time. We have our data pipeline is primarily Kafka. We have an entire connector ecosystem around it. Our data lake is Parquet on S3. We have Redshift for our analytics use cases. We have Cassandra and MySQL as our data stores. We're primarily on AWS, and we made that decision to move to cloud a long time back. I don't know if you've seen this online, but we've open sourced our platform as a service called PASTA, Platform as a Service Totally Awesome. That's what it stands for. And it allows, microservices deployment and provides everything that you need to get set up with a microservices architecture. We moved away from the monolith a while back, even though there's a little bit of that left, which we have to deal with. And then, of course, your usual config management through Puppet and CI/CD pipelines. Flink and Spark as well for all of our stream processing.
Yep, that sounds, that's a lot of technology out there.
Yes.
But so how, talk to me about technology evaluation per se. One of the most important things that a successful company does is constantly reevaluates technology that they are using and starts adopting new technologies per se. Like the way you said, get rid of monolithic, move to microservices, move from data lakes to data lake houses, move from Kafka to like a managed service provider. So how is there something that's done systematically, or is that something that's done intuitively? How does technology evaluation happen?
Yeah, and I think decisions like that always stem from a couple of different things. One is a need to solve technical debt, because obviously you're going to accrue technical debt if you're using certain technologies. And then the second thing is the need to want to be state of the art, right? So I'll talk about the data platform, for example. There was a time when I spoke to you about, like, before the metrics platform existed, there were siloed teams that were doing data and analytics for separate product verticals. So we had a consumer analytics metrics team, we had a biz analytics metrics team, we had a search analytics metrics team, and they all were doing their own kind of data and analytics on their own stacks. And what does that lead to? It leads to data being duplicated. It means data means data is unowned. It means that data is not governed. You don't really have trust in the data that you're developing. It also leads to tribal knowledge, right? So you don't really know, what's the source of truth. And so around 2016 is when this whole data landscape revolution happened, where we decided we want to build single source of truth. And so because we wanted to get rid of a bunch of different things that were plaguing us in terms of making decisions with data, and that became such a significant pain point that we needed to look at this from ground up. So if we did want to build a single source of truth, what ends up happening? Like, you start evaluating things that's capable of supporting such a large problem statement, where you're saying, we want something that can take every single stream of data at Yelp and help it transport from source to sink and store it somewhere for an elongated period of time where people are able to access it. And that's when you kind of get into the you kind of go into the state of the art, where you're like, okay, how have other companies done it? What are current technologies that enable us to do that? And then you eventually bring Kafka in, you bring Flink in, you bring Spark in, you bring Parquet on S3 in, and that's kind of how you develop this whole data platform, right? So, and then that's simply driven by state of the art and simply driven by pain points. Like, if you feel it enough, you're going to have to do something about it. But on the other hand, there's also technical debt, like I told you, and that's when you often come to these build versus buy decisions, where a system becomes so painful to maintain because it's legacy and it's got a ton of technical debt, and you lose institutional knowledge on it, where you're like, should we be rewriting this, or can we just see whether someone's developing a similar solution and just go buy that, instead of putting in developer effort and money into this, especially if it's not your primary business, right? So if it really doesn't relate to your primary business, can you go buy something? So there's often like build versus buy decisions that happen at Yelp very, very often. And that happens right from the engineering level all the way to board of directors trying to make that decision. And so we're constantly doing evaluations based on KPIs to understand whether we should move from one technology to the other, one vendor to the other, or build something in-house.
That's interesting. So when you got started on the data analytics platform, the metrics platform, to where it is right now, how many iterations have gone through it? How many iterations of development have gone through, and how important has data become to you right now at Yelp? And has this, forget the generic answer of data being, yes, it's very important, we use data and everything, but has a unified analytics platform actually helped make things better for everyone? How is it going?
Yeah, I think becoming a data-informed and data-driven culture is very much a cultural problem. It's not a technical problem. So you can develop state-of-the-art tech, and you still have people who will not make decisions based on data, not because they don't want to, but because it's a very, very significant mindset change that you need to go through, because all of us have gut feelings, we have intuitions that a feature will work, this campaign will definitely work. And when the data supports that, we are happy accepting it. But when the data tells us otherwise, then it's very, very hard to accept it. And you really need to be in a place where, healthy skepticism of data is great. But after a few hops, you need to be able to trust that data and say, okay, I was wrong here. We need to move to something else. And so how do you really get from a point of technology is part of it, where you're developing great tech to enable that, but ideally it's cultural change, right? So it's starting from the very top and getting executive buy-in in terms of bringing that data-driven culture at every layer, be it deciding whether a feature should ship, or measuring the success of the projects that you're working on with key results, bringing data into each one of these things and making sure that people are relying on it at some level. It doesn't have to be very accurate, but making sure that the leaders are following that has definitely helped in anchoring some of these decisions in data itself and passing that culture on to the teams. And then, of course, you need to provide incentives to people, because they don't want to wait for several iterations to understand whether the experiment worked or not. And they don't want to go through hoops to, the barrier to entry to actually, start logging that data and seeing the results. That needs to be really low for people to say, okay, I want to do this in a data-driven way. And so that's where technology comes in, like building really delightful tools to use and interfaces where you can try and understand that data, make it self-serve, make the barrier of entry really low. That's another way you can really incentivize people to start becoming data oriented. So that's something that we're doing with the data and analytics platform today, to make sure it's not just solid infrastructure, but there's also delightful user experience on top of it. Yeah,
that sounds great. I think just one more question before we kind of wrap it up. What do you think is the next big thing in as far as in the data and analytics market? Where what's going to be coming up right now that's going to change and revolutionize the entire world?
There's a lot happening. I think the next phase, at least for us, is to be able to figure out how do we build an ecosystem between data producers and consumers, where there's a solid contract that exists for consumers to be able to trust the data that the producers are producing. And then there's many layers to that. It involves data quality monitoring, where upstream data changes and data quality changes are reflected downstream. There's data governance involved, like how do you track data lineage, how do you track ownership? Stuff like schema changes can really be harmful. Schema evolution is a very solid topic. So I definitely think that a lot of companies are struggling with that particular aspect. And how do you tie up all of this? There's an interesting term. It's called a tax you pay on producing data, where if you're a producer of data, you need to be responsible for a few things, right? Starting from the quality of the data to any kind of evolution that happens around it. And we can't entirely base that just on verbal contracts between a producer and a consumer, because producers will leave the company at that point. Who owns the data, right? So you need solid systems around it to make sure that that data is governed. So I think that's the next big thing for us, at least. And I think that there's a lot of different companies trying to solve in that space, building solid data transformation layers. I know DBT is something that's coming up now. Data quality monitoring is very hot right now, and making sure you're able to track workflows of data and point out quality issues at different levels. So yeah, definitely looking forward to solving those challenges, although I don't think it's going to be easy.
So I guess that's a wrap. Great to have you over, Shar. It was really nice having to spend some time with you in spite of your busy schedule. So thanks a lot for doing this for CTOtalk. And we do hope that the next time you're in town, I don't know when that's going to happen. And when we do have a proper CTOtalk, we want to have you over. really nice. Thanks a lot.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for all the insightful questions. And I love doing these things because it always helps me revisit some of my fundamentals as well. So thanks for having me over.